Great to see so many people on the call tonight. I'm Jerry Friedman. I'm a grandma, a mom, and co-chair of ECA. We've got a fantastic evening planned, so please relax and enjoy the presentations. I'd like to introduce to you Bob Inglis. He was elected to Congress in 1992, having never run for our elected office before. He represented the Greenville-Spartanburg area of South Carolina as a Republican in Congress from 1993 to 2010. Bob is the founder and executive director of Republican.org, which is a 501c3 focused on building a nationwide eco-right who believe in a free enterprise solution to climate change. Bob will talk about engaging conservatives on how free enterprise can help solve climate change faster and cheaper than big government regulations, and how it fits with conservative orthodoxy. While he was serving in Congress, he worked across the aisle, and he's now working nationwide to inspire climate solutions that will resonate with conservatives, libertarians, and pragmatists of diverse political opinion. So it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Bob Inglis. Bob, take it away.
Thank you, Jerry. Thanks for the opportunity. I hope my sound is coming through. You hear me okay? Good. So first of all, I've just got to say I'm so glad to be with folks who can really make a difference on climate. And here's what I mean by that is we find that young conservatives are with us. Their parents are harder, and their grandparents are hardest of all. So the fact that we have some grandparents on this call right now tells me that you are crucial to us breaking through to folks in your cohort, because unlike you, a lot of elders are in the spot of not wanting to see much more change. Their grandchildren perhaps want to roll with the punches and get on with the change, particularly when it comes to adapting to climate change, mitigating the impacts of climate change. So it makes you very important emissaries of this message. So I'm glad to be able to share it with you. So here's what we do at republican.org. We are conservatives reaching conservatives on climate change. We believe that the reason that conservatives haven't entered the conversation yet is well, there are a number of reasons, but one of them is, a key one is they haven't heard it in their own language yet. What they've heard is the language of the progressive left, talking about climate change. And they haven't heard it in the language of free enterprise. And so as a result, they don't think they're welcome in the conversation. So what republican.org exists to do is to serve it up in pretty conservative language. We like to talk about Milton Friedman, for example, the late economist who was an advisor to Ronald Reagan, and who was once asked on the Phil Donahue show, well, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate pollution, what would you do about it? And Dr. Friedman says, well, you tax it, of course. And then he goes on to explain why it is that you would tax pollution and essentially internalize negative externalities. So we talk that kind of high octane conservatism. We show clips of Milton Friedman, and we try to get people to hear it in a different way than they've heard it before. Because we believe that free enterprise really can fix climate change if we just fix the economics. And what we have here is a problem of economics that has an environmental consequence. And it is that if I'm Inglis coal-fired electricity, let's say, I get away with socializing my soot right now. It's a pretty good deal for me. I get to just sort of blow through my stack into the air a bunch of small particulates. I get to throw up there some greenhouse gases that will cause climate damages and that cause immediate health damages from those small particulates. And I'm not accountable for those. It's really pretty great for me at Inglis coal-fired electricity. Now, it stinks for my neighbors, but most of them cough it up and just move on. Some of them end up at the hospital. We end up at the hospital. We're all paying for the supposedly cheap Inglis coal-fired electricity now in the healthcare system. Because my small particulates end up in some lungs. The pulmonologists tell us that causes admissions. They show up at the emergency room or get admitted to the hospital and they're on Medicare, like my 95-year-old dad. Well, everybody in America is paying for dad. If they're like my Down syndrome niece who's on Medicaid, everybody in America is paying for her. And if that person showing up in the hospital is covered by Blue Cross and Blue Shield and your family is covered by Blue Cross and Blue Shield, you're paying. So at some point, we're going to say, people are going to say back to me, Inglis coal-fired electricity, Inglis, be even biblically accountable. Hold your ash on your property. Don't do on your property something that harms someone else's person or property. And I'm heard then to complain to the local member of Congress, oh no, that'd be a terrible idea. You know what I'd have to do? I'd have to install additional scrubbers. I'd maybe have to come up with a way to capture that CO2. Terrible idea, Mr. Congressman or Mrs. Congressman or Congresswoman, because if I have to buy that new equipment, I'm going to increase my rates. The Public Utility Commission is going to let me increase my rates. And then your constituents, my customers, can be powerfully mad at you because their energy rates went up. At some point, conservative members of Congress are going to say back to me, if we're successful at republican.org, they're going to say back to me, Inglis, we're already paying the full cost of your supposedly cheap coal-fired electricity. Now, put all your cost on the meter. Let's see how you compare with solar and wind and nuclear and every other source, because those aren't necessarily getting away with socializing their soot. I'm getting away with it. They're not. That's why they need props to exist. If you take away my implicit subsidy of being able to dump into the trash dump of the sky, then it becomes a level playing field. And coal-fired electricity, may just lose to wind and solar and nuclear. That's bad for me, but it's good for the country. It's good for the whole world to have people fully accountable. Because, you know, generally what conservatives believe, and this is the messaging that we do, is that blessings flow from accountability and havoc results from the lack of accountability. Climate change is that havoc that comes from the lack of accountability. So there are problems associated with it, challenges, shall we say, associated with that idea of internalizing negative externalities. Negative externalities, as Dr. Friedman explains in that clip on Milton Friedman's show, on Phil Donahue's show, is where a cost associated with my product isn't attached to the product, it's spread out across society, unwilling participants to the transaction. So if I'm Inglis coal-fired electricity, again, my ability to dump into the trash dump of the sky is an externality. The cost, the healthcare cost, that's an externality. If I'm made accountable for that, it's a process of internalizing to my product that negative externality. The cost of my product goes up. The challenge of that is that pretty obvious that if we're going to bring that accountability through a carbon tax, which we think is a particularly good way to do it at republican.org, particularly if we apply it at the mine and at the pipeline, which is what most people are proposing if they're proposing a carbon tax. Because the beauty of that is there are only 2,000 taxpayers in America who either put stuff in a pipeline or who bring stuff up out of a coal mine. And so it's a very small job for the IRS. And so administratively quite simple. But when you put that price on, it means that now you've got a carbon tax that's, we're paying a tax. So we believe that you've got to cut taxes somewhere else in equal amount or dividend all of that money back to the taxpayers. So there's no growth of government. And so you've heard now accountability, and now you're hearing about no growth of government. These are conservative concepts. And so if you return the money through the dividend or cut taxes somewhere else, now people have money in their pocket to afford the innovation that needs to come. And what does that innovation look like? Well, it looks like solar hot water heater, probably on my roof in places across the South. It means solar cells to make electricity. It means better batteries coming. It means really a different way of powering our lives. Probably the transportation system turning to an electrified system. All kinds of exciting stuff if you're ready to innovate. And again, that's where I started this, and I'm almost to stop and see what your questions and comments are, is that for a lot of people, there's been too much change and they don't want to see any more change. And so that's why I'm particularly excited to find out from you why you're so exceptional, why you're in the category of being willing to embrace this kind of change when some of your cohort, or a substantial part of your cohort, aren't willing to embrace that change. I'm going to guess, but you tell me in the Q&A time whether it's true. I think it may be because you feel that you can have an impact and that something can be better. A lot of people, I think, are stuck thinking that it can't be any better. And you know, if there's something that I can't do anything about, I've just got to accept it. If there's something I can change, then I'll do something different. So I'll give you an example. When I was a kid growing up in Bluffton, South Carolina, back then, it was a small town. Now, way too many people know where Bluffton, South Carolina is. It's near Hilton Head, South Carolina. And Hilton Head came across a bridge and spread to Bluffton. But when I was there, it was a little teeny town. And my dad drove to Savannah every day to work at Union Camp, a bag factory, made paper bags. And the plant stunk, like many paper plants. If you've ever experienced older paper plants, they really stunk. And so when the wind would blow the wrong direction, and in Bluffton it'd start stinking from the 20-mile-away paper plant in Savannah, Georgia, we were taught to say, smells like bread and butter to me, smells like money. If you cooked wood chips on the top of your stove, they'd smell the same way. We had all these explanations. Most of what's coming out of the stack is steam, et cetera, et cetera. So I went off to law school, practiced law in Savannah, Georgia for 2 years. In the course of that time, I did about half my work during those 2 years for a company called Fort Howard Paper Company, which was going to build a paper recycling mill in Effingham County, Georgia, spending $1 billion. And that was real money. Back then, still is real money. 1986, 87, 88, along in there. And so one day, their chairman and CEO was in town to check up on the progress of this new plant, a guy named Paul Sherrill. And we came down to the bank building that my law firm was in, and I was the bag carrier, literally toting the bags for my senior partner, who was talking to Mr. Sherrill, the CEO of Fort Howard. We hit the street in Savannah. Wouldn't you know it, my dad's plant was pumping out and the wind was coming from the west. So downtown Savannah was stinking really badly. So when we hit the door, Paul Sherrill said, how did they get away with that? No community in which we operate would let us do that to them. Fort Howard went on and built that plant and has no appreciable odor. Several years later, my dad's company, by the way, it's not that my dad owned the company. He was an industrial engineer there, assistant bag factory manager. It's not like he owned the place. But a couple years later, my dad's company built a plant in Eastover, South Carolina. No appreciable odor. The reality was they could have retrofitted that plant in Savannah to make it not stink. But as long as the people of Savannah were willing to suffer the stink, they'd stink them out. Because after all, fixing it meant capital outlays, meant improvements, meant costs, meant cutting into the bottom line. And so all those years, those costs were not disappearing into the air. They were being imposed on the people of Savannah. The stuff that came out of the air from my dad's plant, rusted cars. So you'd have a new car that Union Camp was raining on and tearing up your car. So, or your house, the paint job was affected. That all kinds of things, our health was affected. Anyway, so that's a classic case of externalizing those negative externalities, putting them on somebody else and away from your product. And so what it shows is that people could change. I mean, the Eastover plant of Union Camp doesn't smell. The Fort Howard paper plant in Effingham, Georgia doesn't smell. So for some people though, we just assume we can't change it. And so therefore we're stuck with what we've got. And when we get in that frame of mind, we deny the problem and we say we don't have a challenge of climate change because we just can't do anything about it. We got to accept what we've got. But as I stop here and start hearing your questions and comments, and I'm interested in your comments as well as your questions, I sure would love to know what makes you so exceptional that makes you willing to believe that something can be different, something can be better. Because I tell you, if I could figure out how to bottle that and get it to a lot of folks, we could win on this climate thing, and we really could improve life here and around the world. So let me hear your questions and comments, and I'll tell you more about republician.org as we go along.
Thanks so much, Bob. That was great. And we do have some questions and we have some comments also. I would like to make a comment in that we don't see ourselves as being different. We see ourselves as having the same values as others. We're concerned about the future. We're concerned about future generations, our grandchildren, nothing terribly different than others and our age cohort. One of the things that I do see is that we grew up in the civil rights era, in the women's movement, in the Vietnam, and we recognize that people can make a difference, that masses of people can make change because we've seen it before. I don't see any difference in our values at all. So I don't know if that, I'll throw it to the other panelists to see what they think about it as in terms of being different. But, you know, we're elders, we've seen what has happened in the past, and we know what we want for the future for all generations and for all life. So that's, I guess, I don't know if that really addresses it too much, but that's my take on it. We've got some questions I'd like to ask of you from our people that are our participants. One of them, and I noticed from your presentation so far, what you're saying is not terribly different than what we're saying in terms of the actual facts. But you use the word tax, and that seems to make people, especially Republicans, pretty much cringe. So how would you recommend we talk with our Republican legislators when we go to meet with them one-on-one and we want them to take action on climate change? How do you recommend that we frame that to a way that they will hear it and not just shut it down as saying you're just it's just the left, it's just the liberals, it's just progressives, that it's the same playing field?
Yeah, well, first of all, we go ahead and call it a tax because we don't think that we can hide the reality that we are talking about a carbon tax. And so if we, some people prefer to call it a fee or something like that, and that's okay. But as a conservative, I think that fellow conservatives would jump on me with both feet and say, a fee by any other name is a tax, and they'd be right. And so therefore we just go ahead and call it a tax. But we say it's a tax swap, where we're going to, yes, tax something you actually want less of, and put the tax or remove a tax from something you want more of, which would be income, or dividend the money back. So it's a tax swap. It is a new tax, but there's something coming off of tax somewhere else. And so we just think that we may as well be transparent about that. As to how you interact with especially conservative legislators, I think that the way we all need to interact is with authenticity, right? And so if you're a progressive, you needn't try to become a conservative overnight, you know, and go in with, you know, a different suit of clothes and, I don't know, shorter haircut or something. You don't need to do that. But what you need to do is just be who you are. And so it's always better if you can go with somebody who's authentically part of the tribe that you're approaching. But if you can't, then go saying with respect, saying, I'm not part of your tribe, but I'm here because I respect you and I want to know what you think. Then you're talking with transparency. So for example, you know, it's best for me not to try to go to an Orthodox Jewish congregation and say, hey, bros, just like you. Because you know what they're going to say is, no, Inglis, we could tell at the door that you're not. And so probably better for me to say, I'm not like you, but I respect you very much, and that's why I'm here. So now let's talk. All the better if I had somebody who was an Orthodox Jew to go in to speak to that congregation, in which case there might be even more action. But in other words, you got to go with what you got. And so if you're a progressive and you're speaking to a conservative member of Congress, well, don't stop being a progressive, but tell them that you appreciate them and you respect them. If you're a conservative and you're talking to a conservative, then let them know that you're a conservative and part of the tribe. And so it's just, I think those are all things that we sort of learned in kindergarten, I suppose, is just respecting each other and being transparent and honest.
We've got questions for you that are coming through. One of our participants is asking, can you give some examples of how you or others have been able to convince other conservatives to recognize the seriousness of climate change?
Yeah, you know, it's most often it's not that they get convinced of the science. It's more often they get convinced of the usefulness of the solution and the availability of a solution. And that's probably sound a little bit strange to some, because it's like, what are you talking about? They're not convinced of the problem, but they like the solution. Yeah, because we think that mostly what we're dealing with here is something called solution aversion, which is that if I don't think I've got a solution available to me that fits with my values, I doubt the existence of the problem. It's what we all do. It sounds irrational, but we all do it. So, for example, here's a plan of surgery for that back problem you're having. First, we're going to remove your head. After we get your head off, we're going to work on your spine, then we'll put your head back on. Thanks, doc, I'm feeling a lot better. I don't have a back problem, because the solution's nuts. You're not going to take my head off. And so what conservatives so far have heard about climate change, they think sounds nuts. They say, here's where conservatives heard it. The godless scientists got together with the UN bureaucrats. They looped in the Wall Street traders, and they came up with a monstrosity called cap and trade. When that didn't work, the secret Muslim non-American socialist, he's none of those things, but that's what they heard, came up with a regulatory answer called the Clean Power Plan. There's nothing in either of those two paragraphs that's attractive to a conservative. And so you just described a plan of surgery that's clearly unacceptable. And so therefore, I don't have a problem anymore. I don't have a problem with my back problem, and I don't have a climate change problem, because you don't get a solution that's going to work for me. So what we need to do is we need to show them, oh, we got a solution that actually works. It's just untax some form of income or give money back and put a tax on something you want less of. Doesn't that make sense? And then they can, that's what moves people more often than convincing them of the reality of the science. Although I will say, it's a combination of things, right? This is a devilish problem. Getting the world to act on climate change is just a devilish problem. But there are times when people, because of a heart connection, decide to act. So, for example, one time I was speaking with a highly placed fellow in the Mormon church in Salt Lake City, and I'm sitting down in the conference room, and as literally I'm going down in the chair, he says, "You don't need to tell me about climate change." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be a bad meeting. And then he continued, "My skis are hitting rocks." And then I knew we had him, that something in his heart, something he loved to do, which is ski, was being affected by climate change. So he was looking for a solution. And then I was able to tell him about a solution that you all share that's basically pricing carbon dioxide. Another place that I think that it works is relationships, and this is why usually it's going the other way around. Like I say, I'm usually not speaking to elders who are committed to climate action. Typically, I'm going the other way around, which is talking to young conservatives, getting them to write a note to grandma and grandpa, telling them about why we conservatives should care about climate change. Because those relationships can open channels in the heart that make it easier for the head to understand. So in my case, by the way, I didn't tell you this story, but for 6 years, I was in Congress saying climate change is nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And that was the end of the inquiry for me, because I represented a very red district in a very red state in South Carolina. And so then I was out 6 years, running for Congress again in 2004. My son, who just turned 18, came to me and said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." The first of a 3-step metamorphosis. Second step is going to Antarctica with the science committee and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. Go into that if you want to. Third step was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems impossible in a godless science committee trip, but apparently they're not all godless, because this Aussie climate scientist who is showing us the impacts of coral bleaching was, I could tell, worshiping God in what he was showing me. I knew that he was. And so without any words being spoken, I knew we shared a worldview. Later, we had a chance to talk. He told me about conservation changes that he was making in his life in order to love God and love people. And I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. And so I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. And that was one of the key things that got me tossed out of Congress in the June 2010 Republican primary. So it's these it started, though, you see, with my son talking to me. And that's why I say I'm more used to it being young conservatives trying to reach their grandparents and their parents. But you all have this wonderful thing where you're reaching perhaps your children and grandchildren and fellow members of a cohort that polling data shows is not so inclined to climate action. So so together, maybe we can figure this out.
Great, thanks. That was an inspiration to us. We've got some more questions. This one from Mayim, who is asking, how can we show them, meaning the legislatures, the many solutions we could use if we're willing? For instance, regenerative agriculture, et cetera. How do we demonstrate those solutions without closing doors?
Yeah, one thing is to just show them, actually get them to come out and see. It's if you members of a lot of us assume that members of Congress are very inaccessible. And that's somewhat true, perhaps, if you're talking leadership. Like if you're talking the speaker, the majority leader, those people are hard to get in touch with, right? They're quite busy around the whole country. But the average member of Congress, the rank and file member of Congress, is in his or her district probably most every weekend. And much of the month of August and much of the month of November and December, typically, even January. So they're around. And so it's just show them. If you want to show them, for example, regenerative agriculture, ask them to come, get in touch with their office, invite them to come, maybe have the farmers that are doing it or the scientists that are working on it, get them and a group of 10 or 12 people together, and you know what? They'll come, because members of Congress are always interested in talking to groups of people. So, you know, if it's you solo, maybe they're not going to come see your regenerative agriculture thing, because, you know, it's one person at a time. That's sort of hard to do. But if you got a dozen people and you tell them that I got my neighbors, they're coming, and these people, you know, we're going to have some lemonade and we'll show you what we do here on this farm, they'll come. They won't come immediately because they got other things, but you know, plan it enough in advance and they'll come, and you'll be able to show them.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Bob.
We have another question relating to the Citizens Climate Lobby carbon fee and dividend legislation, which sounds like you might be supportive of. Can you just clue us into that, whether you support that piece of legislation?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Citizens Climate Lobby. In fact, I'm on the advisory board, full disclosure. So, you know, they just really doing a fabulous job of organizing people, of getting people charged up about it, and it's really a terrific thing. So the solution that CCL and Climate Leadership Council is suggesting is, yes, a fee or a tax plus a dividend of the money back. And that's completely acceptable to us at republicen.org. We're also open to, if you want to recycle the revenue from the carbon tax into a personal or payroll or corporate tax reduction, that's okay with us too. We're ecumenical as to what you do with the money once it's collected, as long as it goes back to the people. And CCL, surely that's consistent with their proposal, is to give it back in the form of a dividend. The advantage of the CCL proposal over those corresponding tax cuts that I was just mentioning is that it creates a political constituency for a steadily rising carbon tax. And in order for this to work, it needs to be a steadily rising carbon tax. Reason is, economists tell us that there's a substitution effect that will play out here, and that is, as I here in South Carolina see the true cost of coal-fired electricity, I will move away from that cost. I will try to innovate. I will turn down my thermostat in the winter and turn it up in the summer, and you know, make it warmer in my house in the summer and cooler in the winter. I'll maybe get solar cells for my roof. I'll do things, and when I do those things, there'll be declining revenue or declining impact of that carbon tax. And so you got to have it tipped up and steadily rising. And as a conservative, as long as you're going to give me a corresponding tax cut or an increased dividend check from that larger carbon tax, what's not to like about that? And but it makes sense. The CCL, the strongest argument, I think, for the CCL revenue recycling into a dividend is that it creates a constituency. People like the idea of getting a larger check. You know, so if it starts out, let's say, at $2,000 for a family of four, and it rises to $2,100, that's the right direction. People like that idea. It's sort of like the Alaska Permanent Fund. People sure do like it when that money goes, when that check goes up. So that's the strongest reason for the recycling the revenue through a dividend.
Thanks. To follow up on that, how do we counteract? This is a question from Tim. How do we counteract the House vote against a carbon tax? How do we frame a response to that?
Oh, great question. Yeah, very topical because it's just last week. I was about to dismissively say we laugh at it, but I guess I shouldn't laugh at it. But it's a silly resolution, so why not laugh about it? So, like, I don't think you should take it seriously, honestly. I mean, Steve Scalise put forward this resolution that describes some villainous carbon tax that must be hiding under the bed because I haven't seen it in anybody's proposals anywhere. It was a revenue positive carbon tax. In other words, we're going to tax carbon, we're not going to give the money back. And it was not border adjustable. It was not going to apply to the rest of the world. Well, who would be for that one? The answer, nobody. I mean, if I were still in Congress, I think I probably would have voted yes. And then sort of chuckled at Steve and said, Steve, what a joke, man. Why'd you put this resolution on the floor? That's not, nobody's talking about that kind of a carbon tax. I mean, it'd be like, and I'm against melting ice cream too. Why didn't you put that in there? And I'm against hot dogs getting cold. I'm against, I don't know, keep on going with a list of useless things to talk about. Because, and take up time on the House floor when we got serious business to do. I mean, in a way, I think we should just view it with contempt. But let me stop there, because you know why? I'm thinking there's some wonderful CCLers on the phone who know that you're not supposed to act that way. You're supposed to be nice. And that's the wonderful thing about CCL. They'd be much nicer than I'm describing. So here's how to be nice. Well, Steve, I guess we just haven't explained to you how it is that the carbon tax would work when we give all the money back and we apply it to imports. Wasn't that nicer than what I was just talking about? I'm sorry, I was not very nice in what I said. So I got to learn to be nicer. I got to learn to be like CCLers. So, but honestly, the resolution was, it's a farce. I mean, there's nobody proposing that carbon tax. And so, so I think that's just the thing to point out is nobody's talking about that, such a carbon tax. Nobody wants to make it revenue positive. You know, somebody who I've been inspired by in this way is Art Laffer. Art Laffer, Ronald Reagan's economics advisor, is a neighbor of Al Gore's in Nashville, Tennessee. Art has been over to Al's house. This I've heard from Art and confirmed by Al. Art has been over to Al's house. They talked it through. They came to the conclusion that a revenue neutral, border adjustable carbon tax, which is what we're talking about here, and not what Steve Scalise was talking about, it was acceptable to both of them. Al, because he desperately wants to reduce emissions. Art, because he'd do anything to reduce a tax on income. And so, so I thought, you know, this is pretty impressive. These two people, if we can get Art Laffer and Al Gore to agree, we can bring America together. The thing that's very impressive about Art, Reagan's advisor, Art Laffer, is that he goes out of his way to protect the reputation of his literal neighbor, Al Gore, and honoring the Ninth Commandment. You know, there's a positive side to the Ninth Commandment about not bearing false witness, which is, you know, building the reputation, protecting the reputation of your neighbor. And so Art goes out of his way to protect Al Gore's reputation by saying Al has never been for a revenue positive carbon tax. It's always been revenue neutral. And so good for Art Laffer being that way and making sure to protect Al Gore, his neighbor's reputation. And that's what we all should do, is just say, listen, Steve, we're not talking about a revenue positive carbon tax.
Thank you. We have some more questions. If you have a few more minutes to answer questions.
Sure.
From one of our participants, you mentioned that the older generation is hardest to get active on climate change. Do you have any ideas on ways to communicate with the more conservative grandparent generation? Yeah,
hold on just a second. I'm going to reach down. I'm going to disappear because I got to plug this computer in. Otherwise, I'm going to go dark here. Okay, there we go. how to reach senior conservatives. I think the most effective way is through their grandchildren, actually. It really is a relationship thing. It's a matter of tribal identity. This is what it is if you, and I found this out going door to door a lot, which I did a lot when I was a member of Congress, running for Congress and when I was serving in Congress, is quite often you didn't have to wait to ask the people a question. You could just look around them at the door and see what's on the TV. And if Fox was on, you know what they were going to say. If it's MSNBC, you knew they were going to say the opposite. And so we have a real challenge on our hands, which is people are receiving news on their news island, and they're getting affirmed in whatever it is that they believe. And so when they come in contact with somebody who's listening to MSNBC or Fox, vice versa, they think they've just landed from Mars. They don't understand the people. And so one way to break through that, I think, is through the relationships of family and friendships. And that's where really the people that I'm talking to right now, people who, grandparents who do care about climate, are in a unique position to influence your compatriots, your people in your age cohort. Friends at church or synagogue, or people in the bowling league or bridge club or whatever it is that you do, and just bring it up. That's the thing. I mean, what we find out, we know from our colleagues at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University, which is where we're located, is Republic EN is part of the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason. What we know from their work is that people don't talk about climate. Not at Thanksgiving, not at Easter or Passover. They just don't talk about it. So we need to have people talking about it. And so bring it up when you're really the group you are very powerful to reach your friends. And if you find a conservative, encourage them to come look at our stuff at republicen.org, or challenge them if they need to be challenged to look at our stuff. Tell them it's, if they're progressive, send them to Bill McKibben and 350.org. He's a great guy and got great stuff going on. If they're conservative and they need to be convinced, send them to our site, republicen.org.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're running low on time. Maybe we have time for one more question. This is from Joe. So he's talking about the alternative, when you're talking about the paper factory, is the alternative to require the paper factories from stopping to pollute, but those strategies tend not to be viable because of what they're saying is a small government approach. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, there are two very respectable views. I think one is that you could have the view that what we have here is a scientific problem. We need to get down to 350 parts per million, and we need to regulate down to that. That's a respectable position. It's not our approach at republicen.org. Our approach is, yes, we need to get down to 350. We'd like to get lower. We need to do that. But the fastest, most efficient way to do that is simply by pricing carbon dioxide, putting a price signal in effect. The good news for us in that position is I think most economists are with us. And not I think, I know most economists are with us. In fact, it's really hard to find an economist who disagrees with that notion. I once asked a very senior economist at Virginia Tech to give me the name of somebody who would disagree with that. Because I said, there must be some economist who's written the opposite of that. And he thought for a while, and then he said, nope, I can't think of any. Because he said, you know what? You can't be an economist if you don't believe in the concept of internalizing negative externalities. He said it'd be like being a scientist and not believing in the scientific method. He said, no, it doesn't exist. And so it just gives me great confidence to say, you know, there's a way to get there by this price signal. But I got to admit, what I'm expressing there is a fair amount of faith in the power of free enterprise. And not everybody shares my faith in the power of free enterprise. So some people would prefer a regulatory answer and regulate down to that. That's respectable. But if we're going to convince conservatives to act on this, it really will be a price signal. And the good news is there's so many progressives that agree with the price signal, and a growing number of conservatives could accept that. That means we can bring America together and get a price signal done. If we attempt to do it by regulation, there will be a backlash among conservatives, just like there was on Obamacare or the Clean Power Plan. So, so we got to figure out a way, and this again is consistent with the wonderful ethic of CCL, is some way to bring people together and to find a path forward that works for both conservatives and progressives.
Thank you. I have one last real quick question, which is probably a very easy answer for you, from David. And it's, where do you see the best opportunity to get debate going on a carbon tax? Is that in the House or the Senate? And where should we really apply our energies?
Well, as of today, it's in the House, because Carlos Corbello has just introduced a carbon tax bill that's the first time since some fella from South Carolina introduced a carbon tax in 2009. But it's going to go better for Carlos, because we're no longer in the midst of the Great Recession. The economy is much better. People have experienced climate change, and he's got a very creative idea. It's not exactly the proposal we've got. It's not exactly the CCL proposal. It's just, it's a little bit different, but at least it's the start of the conversation about climate change and a carbon tax, a pricing mechanism. And so the answer as of today would be the House and Carlos. I'd love it if some senators would introduce companion legislation in the Senate. I'd particularly love it if my friend Jeff Flake would introduce it, because when I had the bill that I was talking about in 2009, Jeff Flake was my Republican co-sponsor. And, you know, he was attacked for being on that bill in his first Senate primary. And Jeff Flake didn't back down, because I knew that Jeff Flake does not back down. He said, yes, I was on Bob Inglis's bill. It's a good bill. It's a way to deal with climate change. Next question. And so I hope that Jeff, maybe before he leaves the Senate, would introduce a companion to Carlos's bill.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Bob. I think everybody has really enjoyed this, and I thank you for listening to our questions. We'll certainly try to reach out to other grandparents and other elders. Not that we haven't been doing that thus far, but we seem not to have so far been able to really convince conservative grandparents of climate change. I think in part because what they're hearing is it's a hoax, and that's, you know, a bit of a problem for us to counteract. But I thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.